What is up guys, Alex from Lakey Wargames here, and welcome to today's video where we were right! We successfully predicted something from last year that's going to happen in 4th edition. So let's talk about it and talk about how awesome it's going to be for the game going forward. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, last year I made a video that was titled "What changes to spears do we need in AOS 4.0?" and I'm going to put a screen grab up on the screen for you now, just as a bit of one of the slideshows from that video, just to give some context into what we were talking about. And basically, one of the things that's always really bothered me in this game was unit profiles such as the Mortek Guard that you can see there, having the difference between Netherite blades and Netherite spears, and the only difference was with the spears you gained an inch of reach, and with the swords you gained +1 to hit, and it just never made sense, especially being on those 25mm bases where you can see there is less than an inch, so you could technically fight in 2 ranks on a 25mm base with the sword, so you'd be fighting in 2 ranks anyway, and you just always want the +1 to hit. With all the other buffs that come around in your army from your heroes and your command abilities at present, it was just better to have a better profile, and then you can stack the other buffs in other ways. And it just made spears absolutely pointless. Now, we did see at the time, we saw from the Uruk War clans when they got the new Ard boys, and they got some really cool things where the spears had a defensive buff to them when they got charged, and the blades had a more offensive thing when they were doing some charging. And we also already saw this a very, very long time ago with the Venari Wardens from the Lumineth Realm Lords with their Wall of Blades, where they would get +1 to wound rolls and +1 to rend when they received a charge with their pikes. And at the time, this got me thinking about how spears in the game should and could be more effective if there was more things like that. And when the Ard boys came out, it was just proof in the pudding that you could have these sort of diverse weapons within the same unit, because there are so many unit profiles in the game where there are choices between picking a blade and a spear, or maybe it's like axes or things like that, which would basically still count as the blades anyway, but in essence picking between a hand weapon and a spear, and they should be able to do different things. Now, back then we talked about the Bonds of Battle, which was the old special rule for the Galatian veterans, which was a general's handbook ruling at the time, which allowed you to fight within half an inch of a friendly model who was in half an inch of an enemy, to basically be able to counter out some of the range difference from the weapons when trying to see how many attacks you could get in, and going around different ways to get attacks in with blades and spears, and making an advantage with the extra range that you would get from the spears. But now we know in Age of Sigmar 4.0 that that is all going away, and if as long as you're within 3 inches, you get to count your attacks, which is a great healthy change for the game. Now, one of the things that we did get to see as well is, and this was what confirmed it for me, that this is going to be something going forward, and that we were right. We got there. We made a prediction, and hopefully we're going to see it a lot more in the game. Now, I do just say take this with a pinch of salt, because although we see it on this profile here, and I'll put the Vindicators War Scroll up on the screen just in case you haven't seen it yet, but this is the only time that we have seen it so far, although things that we have seen different weapon abilities from different war scrolls doing different things. This is the first one we've seen where it's a more defensive thing on something with a spear. So we can see it here up on the screen with the Storm Spear, which is a 2-attack weapon, 3s and 3s to hit and wound, 1 rend, 1 damage, but we see that a new ability profile at the very end, which is something new to 4th edition. And we have anti-charge +1 rend. And what this means is when the Vindicators get charged themselves, they get +1 rend for that turn in which they fight. So that makes these 2 attacks, 3s and 3s, -2 rend and 1 damage spears, just for getting charged. And this is something that's going to be absolutely amazing, and I really hope we see more of this anti-charge ability on more units with spears, because when we compare these to the Liberators, which we also saw, this is going to really help build some in-depth tactical thinking to your list building of, do I want these guys with spears or do I want these guys with their hand weapons? As we can see, the Liberators here have a very similar profile, 2 attacks, 3s and 3s, 1 rend, 1 damage, but they have crit mortal instead of the anti-charge ability. So that means that these guys are going to be dealing mortal wounds when they roll 6s to hit, instead of getting more rend when they're charged. So this automatically makes these two different units, or two units that could be very similar, just one has a big hammer and one has a spear. It now differentiates them to the spears are the defensive unit and the hammers are the more consistent, sort of well-rounded tool. So depending on how you want to build your list, if you had lots of shooting, you've got heroes with magic that don't necessarily want to be fighting, you can now stand behind your wall of spears, move up onto an objective and basically taunt the enemy into come and get me, charge into my spears, they're going to get awesome, I dare you kind of thing. And your liberators are going to be more of that well-rounded, they can go on the offensive or they can get charged, they're going to be a bit more consistent to you. But when you do receive that charge, you're probably going to wish that you had some spears with some cool anti-charge abilities in there. And I just really like the level of sort of tactical flex that brings into that list building process of, do I want these more defensively buffed units, or do I want these sort of more consistent kind of open-ended style of play? And this isn't the only thing that we see here. With the Vindicators, they also have their own rule built into them. So the weapon ability, the anti-charge, is what really sort of excites me about this, because that's going to be a generic weapon ability that's bolted on to the end of the melee weapon profile. That gives me hope that we're going to see this a lot more across things with spears and halberds and pikes and that kind of thing. So things like the Wardens are probably going to have this anti-charge. Things like OBR with the Immortus Guard and their big sort of halberds and shields are going to probably have things like this anti-charge weapon ability onto their melee weapons. Again, we haven't seen it until those PDFs drop, we won't know for certain. But the other really cool thing is this hold the shield wall, and it's an effect that's only to the Vindicators here, but when this unit did not charge this turn and is in combat with an enemy unit that charged this turn, roll a dice, and on a 4+, this unit has the strike first effect for the rest of the turn. So not only do these guys get +1 rend, but there's now a 50-50 chance that they're going to gain strike first, so you would have charged them, given them more rend, and then they could hit you before you hit them, even though it's your turn. And if there's more special rules like this that's going to be floating around for those units that I spoke about, like the Venari Wardens, like the Immortus Guard for the OBR, then it's going to really give a new lease of life to these defensive units. And myself as a player, I really do love defensive playstyles. And that trade-off of things that your units aren't as powerful as the others, but again, you're playing for that defensive kind of whittle down in the attrition battle, rather than the straight up, my super unit is going to absolutely delete whatever I point it towards. And just seeing this in the Vindicators scroll really gives me hope that these more defensive units in the game are going to be less sort of irresistible tanks that can just take everything that you want and just instead punish the enemy for sort of charging into you, but in a way that it's going to be a bit balanced out. So for example, looking at the Kroxigor war scroll here, we can see that they have anti-infantry +1 rend, so even if they are charging into said spears, and these spears are going to get plus rend, they're also getting things like rend and other abilities that we haven't seen just yet. There might be ones with more damage, better hit profile, better wound profile, we don't know. These are just the handful that we have seen, but it seems like these offensive units are going to be getting their buffs for going into the right targets, and the defensive units are going to get buffs for just being charged by any target, and that really plays into those profiles. And like I said before, it just really layers in that tactical flexibility and ability to build things in your list and make sure that the right units are getting to the right places at the right time, and that's something that I think is only going to be good for the game. And the reason I wanted to bring up these Kroxigors and talk about them as well is not just for the sort of anti-infantry +1 rend thing, but things like the brutal blows, where they're going to get +1 damage to their melee weapons when they target someone that has 10 or more models. So it's not like these defensive units are suddenly going to be super amped up and everyone's going to want them. Well, I won't say that for definite because we don't know how the meta is going to shake out just yet, but it gives that incentive of, this is going to be my big unit for smashing things apart, this is my more defensive unit for getting onto the objective first and putting down that shield wall, and it's going to make this nice tug of war that if you've balanced your list, you're going to make sure again that you want these right units in the right places doing things at the right time, and it just makes units feel impactful colourful and thematic, and that's something that I really praised 3rd edition for doing. All the battle tomes felt, more often than not, really thematic in the way that they played, the way that their abilities were sort of worded, and the way that they worked on the table, and just the general feel of the army. And now that we're seeing these sort of ability weapon profiles and these passive abilities on each of the units, it makes things feel like they should. So Liberators should be better at, pushing things off objectives. These Vindicators are great at absorbing charges, putting up a shield wall. Kroxagar are absolutely amazing at smashing through infantry, and it just gives me so much hope for things going forward. Like, I can't wait to see what a giant dragon does. One of my most favourite scrolls, and something that I'm really excited for as a Nighthaunt player is going to be Kurdos Valentian himself. I can't wait to see what that mace does. I'll be really disappointed if it's not something really cool now, but things like that is just going to be really exciting to see going forward, and it was nice to be able to make that prediction and talk about spears and something I would love to see in the game, and now it's here, it's happened, it's happening. Let's hope for more of this cool stuff going forward. But what do you guys think about this changes? What do you think about the Vindictus scroll? What do you think about the sort of melee weapon abilities that we have seen so far? So things like the anti-charge, crits, doing mortals, anti-infantry. Do you think that this is something that's good for the game? And are you happy to see that these more defensive profiles are actually gaining buffs for playing defensively, while the more aggressive profiles are going to be gaining things for being more aggressive into the right targets? Let me know in the comments down below, or you can join the Lakey Wargames Discord, which is linked in the description below, where we're always having all kinds of awesome hobby chats from all the different factions, all the different games, as well as showcasing some awesome hobby goodness that we're all working on at the same time. But that's enough from me today, guys. As always, stay safe, happy wargaming.